Çatalhöyük is an enormous archaeological site in Turkey, in middle, sort of south Turkey, in what's called the Konya Plain, not far from the big town of Konya. It's probably one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. And when people talk about archaeological sites in Turkey, they think first and foremost of GÖBEKLI TEPE. But Çatalhöyük is important for another reason. In Çatalhöyük, we get to focus on people, what people were up to. The focus at GÖBEKLI TEPE has been so much about temples and the origins of civilization and that kind of thing. But Çatalhöyük, not so much temples, houses.
Age-wise, it's about 9,500 years ago. People were living there for about 1,500 years, which in itself is quite remarkable, settled in what was originally, there was meandering river delta, these plots of land, islands poking up out of the water, so that clearly they chose the biggest one to settle on, we suppose.
In terms of it being important from its size, because it stands out for that reason as well. You don't get settlements the size of Çatalhöyük from a long time after the time it fell out of disuse and people moved away from it.
Do you know, I know we've said it more than once at different places, but it's when you look at the density of this and you think that this is only a small part of what they've excavated. You know, there's the other mound over the other side, and it is only 5%. You know, what they've done is only 5% of the whole site. And you look at the density of that, and you can just get a sense of quite how many thousands of people there were.
So it stands alone, as far as we know, at this time period, which is, what, roughly 7,500 BC to 6,000 BC or thereabouts.
Yes, how long have the excavations been going on? Well, originally, James Mellett started a very long time ago. It was taken over by Ian Hodder, who was running the place over 25 years ago. He was actually head of excavations there for over 25 years, I think. So that's going to be over 30 years ago now. It's remarkable, really, when you consider the depth of it. The tell is 21 meters deep.
Tells are pretty common things when we talk about Middle and Near East and even when we get over into Greece and the Balkans. But tells, as they're called, arise when you get communities, simply put, they're building upon building upon building.
In the same way that we do now, we know that if we dig down, just take any average town, dig down and there's old pavements and houses under your feet.
They're living in their houses and then they come to a period where they go past their sell-by date, if you like, and instead of moving to somewhere else, they maybe raise to the ground or use the original foundations to build on again, or sometimes they don't raise to the ground. And so it takes an appreciation of the lengths of time involved, but over time you get tells building up into these mounds, which are pure archaeological delight, because a tell tells you a story.
Çatalhöyük is many layers. It's about 18 layers of houses that they've identified.
And we're digging down through 1,500 years of archaeology, through not just through the depth of the site, but as far as they can through the breadth of the site as well.
Which is why it's taken them so long to dig down that depth in such small, localized areas. People wonder why it takes so long to excavate these places, but that's why. Going down that depth, it's immense.
If you had to go down into one of the houses in Çatalhöyük, I don't know what it would remind you have? Because, I mean, the sense would be of being a little bit subterranean.
The actual functions of houses is really interesting because the houses themselves were accessed through the roof.
And you descend some wooden ladders, and round about your feet you'd have to narrowly avoid the oven, maybe narrowly avoid an open fire.
It sounds like they'd be open to the elements, but actually the top is thought to have had a sort of porch, a cover.
And you wouldn't be too far away as you put your feet down to perhaps where relatives may be buried under the floor there, in the northern part of this room, and then maybe back towards the southern end of the room as you turn around, be more the domestic living area, and maybe off to one side there'd be another room for storage and that kind of thing.
The houses seem to have been compartmentalised. I think that's the best way of putting it. That they seem to be more decorated in the north side of the house, even though the houses are small. The north was decorated. Burials were in the north, so there was this demarcation of perhaps something more special on the north side, for whatever reason, and the south side more lived in.
If you're lucky, and you go into a particular house, you may be treated to extraordinary murals as well.
Intriguing that some houses were very decorated, others weren't particularly decorated, and it's impossible to say, because we don't know whether it was a hierarchical system or an egalitarian system. It's broadly thought that it was egalitarian. But because we don't know for sure, and there are no patterns in whether a more elaborate building, a more decorated building, was more special than any other. It could have been that it was just personal taste.
Because they took great care of the walls, certainly around the north end of the houses. They were tended to be painted white, or as near white as possible, and decorated with imagery in red ochre.
There seems to have been a shrine of some sort in the corner of each building. Sometimes they were marked out by, you may have seen photographs of these aurochs skulls, or bull skulls, with these massive antlers marking off a corner of the building. It's thought that this was a shrine, although that's not certain.
So the imagery is quite striking inside.
This is quite interesting. Nets. What's the context? Because this is a replica. They actually excavated this here. It's obviously it's in the museum in Ankara now, but they excavated this whole frieze. So this is an accurate reproduction of it. And so people doing stuff, people hunting, people dancing, people all sorts. But this guy with, is it a net or is it a panel of some description in front of, what the hell is that? It's a pig, I guess. Pig bull. Pig. Looks like this dude's got a boomerang. A few of them. Gosh, yeah. Maybe.
How light, how dark it would be in there, how it would be lit, I don't know. How much light descends into these parts, and how much time people would actually spend living in these rooms for that very reason. Would you be living on the roof most of the time, spending most of your time sort of outdoors on the roof? Would most of your activities be taking place on the roof? I don't know. I remember we descended down some proper stairs into the reproduction room at the visitor centre at Çatalhöyük, and I think our breaths were pretty much taken away. We saw Liz, our fixer, as she descended the stairs, she said, "I want to live here."
Wow, I want to live here. I want to live here.
I don't know if I share that sentiment. It looked all a bit pristine and clean. I don't think that it looked quite as pristine and clean, certainly in the southern end way back then.
In its way, Çatalhöyük is a surprisingly large community because there's, when you look at surrounding excavations, surrounding sites that have been found, they're all very small, and suddenly you have this this massive community.
The population estimate has been placed at 8,000 and under, or thereabouts.
The whole functioning of society at Çatalhöyük is in itself, it's slightly enigmatic because there's clues, but there's no in-your-face evidence. So there's been a lot of debate about whether anything that size could have been egalitarian.
Now, a couple of sociologists came along when it had been determined that the population size of Çatalhöyük was 8,000 or thereabouts. They said, no, not possible at all. You can't have this many people living together unless there's a hierarchy to keep it that way. Otherwise, they'd be knocking 7 bells out of each other. The minimum number you could possibly, maximum number you could possibly have would be 200. Beyond that, all hell breaks loose.
You would think something of that size would only function if it was hierarchical. But there are various things that give clues or seem to imply that it's egalitarian. Number one, there have been no special buildings found.
Yet. Because again, as a sidebar, you've got the thing that, only 5% of the total area available to archaeology has been excavated. So they haven't found the larger rooms, the special rooms that would speak to people gathering together or having holding accommodation for the great and the good, separate and away from the populace.
No houses that are massively bigger than any others, nothing that's decorated particularly more than any others, or certainly in the houses that are more decorated, there are contradictory clues when you find another house that's not decorated that seems to be more important in other ways.
To be fair, a large amount of ground-penetrating radar survey has been undertaken, and that just shows the similar pattern of the existing known houses repeating in a sort of basic north-south orientation. But they seem to, by and large, be very similar sized rooms. So the jury's out, sort of, but the received opinion in that this was an egalitarian society.
Health and well-being is a marked thing at Çatalhöyük as well, because it seems that if there's huge levels of huge levels. There's about a 20% child mortality rate, which is high. You know, that's a lot of children dying. But it seems that if a child got to the age of about 10, then they're all right. And there are lots of burials where the people have reached their 60s and 70s, which for this period in history is, that's quite impressive, really. They're eating well, and that in itself is another indicator of a pretty peaceful environment. People aren't dying young because of violence and aggression. Various things that do point to it being egalitarian, and the biggest one is that they have found no instances of excessive violence. None of the bodies that they have excavated have been murdered.
So there doesn't seem to have been interpersonal violence going on.
There's no arrows in anybody. There's no knife wounds on bones.
There does seem to have been some blunt force trauma to the skull. That's another issue. But the evidence isn't there for people fighting amongst themselves. So what was it that was controlling this society and holding it together?
Children weren't necessarily growing up with their biological families.
They've been able to work out from the burials and the relationship of the people in the burials to the people living in the particular rooms is they're not necessarily directly related. So in each household, you've got a genetic mix suggesting that at an early stage in their lives, children have been fostered out into the community or to specific, other families.
That's really interesting, because it means that if you're always nurturing other people's children and other people are nurturing your children, then you're going to want that to remain a peaceful environment, aren't you? The fear of your children being in danger elsewhere in the city would be enough to keep everybody quite peaceful, I would think.
Whether that's a glue that can hold an egalitarian society together, that's a discussion for another time. There are so many facets of the society which may seem to us quite alien.
People were buried in the floors of the houses, and this isn't unusual. You find it all over the world, and you find it through time, that people have often been buried in their houses.
In the whole of the excavation period of Çatalhöyük, certainly during the last 30 years of excavation, they've taken up around about 800 skeletons, 800 remains of 800 people out of the floors. Some of the rooms didn't have any burials in them, some did, up to, it seems, one room had at least 62 burials in it. Until that you'd achieved some kind of maturity, I don't know what the rites of passage in mid-teens or something like that would have been, but you'd have been less likely to have been buried in the northern area along with the, it seems that there's a sort of citizenhood level that needed to be achieved before you were recognised enough to be buried in that part of the house. Otherwise, you could probably be buried underneath the store cupboard. As much as anywhere else. I mean, you don't get infants, certainly don't infants and young people buried in the northern part of the house. As a sidebar to that, it seems that any outsiders, because of course they can do the genetic studies of where people have come from that have been living at Çatalhöyük, it seems that outsiders weren't afforded that luxury of being buried in the northern quarters of a house. They too were more likely to be buried underneath in other areas and in the storage rooms alongside the youngsters. So there's some kind of citizenship going on here, whether you're an outsider or if you're too young to have passed the threshold. Burial underneath the floor seems odd to us, but also the fact that it seems that the bones that have come out of the ground, out of these burials, are articulated, i.e. the bodies must have been put in whole, which raises a few questions about hygiene, smell.
It's not for nothing that graves are 6 feet in the ground.
I think there is some evidence to suggest otherwise, that some of the bodies have been bundled in some way before they've been interred, and there may have been a period of time, quite a long period of time, between death and interment.
So that means that it was an intact body when it went in the ground. It's not, as we've seen in different cultures, for example, where you have bodies left out to rot or be pecked, eaten away by birds and animals before the bones are collated and brought in.
So the suggestion is that the bodies have been treated in some way.
Were they being dried, smoked, whatever it might be?
Somebody said there was a smoking treatment, perhaps. They were kippered, I don't know.
What does seem to be the case is that there are secondary burials. So, for example, some bodies, whilst they might be articulated skeletons, they might not be fully articulated. There might be limbs missing.
Limbs are not always all there. Heads, certainly. We've got quite a lot of headless bodies. So things are being kept back as mementos within the family or within the community. And it seems being passed around as well.
And obviously we can't say why or over what period of time, but they have been moved and reburied.
And I think there is a suggestion that sometimes his bones are in bundles.
For example, I think one of the most fascinating things for me was they found a woman buried who was clutching a skull. She was holding it to herself as if this was, my interpretation was, it looks like it's a loved one. This person was holding on to the skull. And the thing about that skull was they found that it had been plastered
and paint applied to the plaster.
And replastered 4 times. So basically putting an artificial face back on, replacing the features of the deceased.
Is the idea to have the person of the deceased persist in time through the plaster and the painting of a face and those kind of things. Intriguing, to say the least.
But certainly managing the dead and burying people together, we don't know whether the people buried together were a community or were they strangers. Was it just did someone just knock on your door and say, we've got someone else that needs burying, have you got room in yours? We don't know. The site is big. The overall area that's been identified is roughly 13-14 hectares. So that's about 35-ish acres of land. And 21 meters of depth. You can see that that's an awful lot of residential houses to be excavated.
We don't know if there are other sites like Çatalhöyük to be found yet in Anatolia or elsewhere. Certainly smaller sites, there are any number of those, and from times before up to 1,000, 1,500 years before, we get places like just up the road, Çatalhöyük, which is a small village, 150 people. And yet that displays many of the similar societal traits that exhibited at Çatalhöyük on a smaller scale. Still got burials under the floor. You still got burials concentrated towards the northern end of the hut.
You could almost call it a proto-city, a large town where we don't know exactly how many people were living there, but certainly it seems likely that it was thousands. The upper estimates have been 8,000, lower estimates around 2,000 maybe. But it's how people lived together, being able to excavate how people were living. That's the most important thing. You know, so often we find in archaeological excavations that we find the signs of what people did. Particularly, you know, when you come into Western Europe and you're looking at whether it's stone circles or dolmens, that you have these structures that people left behind, but with very little clue as to anything about the people themselves. And here at Çatalhöyük, what you have is people. It's all about the people and how they were living.
When we visited Çatalhöyük, one of our big takeaways, of course, was how phenomenal the visitor centre was, the brand new one. We were actually the first people that were privileged enough to see the inside of it. And I remember one big animated CGI diorama of the whole scene of Çatalhöyük, of the town, city, village, whatever you call it, on the mound, and people working the fields around about. You know, the semi-wild or the cereals, wheats, emmas, whatever they are.
One of the more recent discoveries at Çatalhöyük was they found some uncooked dough with an oven, which is fantastic, really. So we know for a long time that societies were making breads, flatbreads, from wild grains. So it's to see a situation where people are beginning to grow particular kinds of grains to make particular kinds of bread.
It seems that it was particularly fertile. It's at the sort of like it was surrounded by wetland that was fed by the confluence of two rivers, I think. There's certainly a sort of like a little mini delta area there with islands and rivulets and streams running through. Just a perfectly fertile environment that doesn't actually occur that often, where you've got a confluence of qualities of land that come together to provide wetland and fertile soils where you can manage your cereals, but also the rivers for fish and fowl and lands beyond for the hunting of game. It's a very particular place. These places are contingent upon very particular sets of circumstances for them to arise in these places. Goes without saying that with an archaeological site that's been under excavation for 30 years, that there's a fair amount of material stuff, objects.
What's coming out of excavations? What people left behind?
Figurines, tools.
There's the things you'd expect to find, like obsidian blades.
Obsidian was hugely important at Çatalhöyük, and particularly at Çatalhöyük for some reason. There seemed to be hordes of obsidian, roughed out obsidian, ready to be made into useful tools and so on and so forth. So I don't know whether they were trading obsidian, whether it was a sort of staging point for trading in obsidian, I'm not quite sure. But at Çatalhöyük, there's a heck of a lot of this stuff. And of course, in terms of not just hoards, but in finished tools as well, of all shapes and sizes. Querns, grinding stones, those sorts of things which speak to the kinds of things that people were eating. We do have some pottery.
Ceramics, that art was quite impressive.
I think one of the most thing that people most want to read into are the figurines and those little bits of sculpture that are representational of animals or of people. There's one particularly striking figurine. It's probably quite a familiar image when people think of Çatalhöyük, and that's of the large seated woman on what looks like a throne.
That's what it looks like. It could just be somebody sitting in an armchair, but it looks like somebody sitting on a throne.
Some have said that it's a woman giving birth. I say, not so fast. This is a woman that looks like she's in charge of the situation, whatever it is, speaks to somebody in authority, because there aren't any corollary figures of men in yet. Bearing in mind we're still only got 5% of the surface area excavated. But it speaks very much to a woman in a place of authority.
Pots, that's it's interesting when you're looking at the pre-pottery Neolithic that we find an increasing number of pots.
It bothers me, that they still call it PPNB, don't they? PPNB, pre-pottery, Neolithic pottery.
So much for names.
Little figurines of animals that look like playthings, or they could be important objects for people to carry around. Who knows? But they look sort of, you can imagine them being formed in the hand. They've got that sort of rough, sort of semi-abstract form or abstracted form of the animal in question. That it's like they've been, like I remember playing with plasticine at school. It was easy to make something like that in your hands.
One of the most significant things for me was bricks. Bricks. And the thing is, bricks, it's a game changer. That you look at a house, pick any house anywhere, and I'm talking about in this period of history, where you're used to seeing mud huts. We see mud huts or wattle and daub huts all over the place, where people are just coating the walls with plaster, and that's fine. But the thing about bricks, as soon as you get clay bricks together, it's modular. You can do what you want. You can make any shape you like. And the thing is that it means that you can almost have it on an industrial scale. That you could have people who are making bricks, and it does give you a clearer idea or a clearer sense of why a city can develop in so simple a way, because everything's modular. Just add to it. You can have such a comparatively small area containing an awful lot of people. Whereas if you're constricted to round wattle and daub houses or mud houses, then there's only so many people you can get into an area. It just changes how people can live together.
Coming away from Çatalhöyük and visiting the archaeological site, seeing one area of the excavation, seeing what the landscape is now and the breadth of it, the Konya plain that's in, and also seeing the visitor centre. It came away with a feeling of familiarity, and yet it felt alien at the same time. Familiarity because, as Liz said as she came down the stairs, I could live here. It's a perfectly habitable room given all that you have, all you have in order to subsist. And yet it seems there are little hints here, there and everywhere of a society that behaves, interacts with each other and holds itself together in quite an alien way to what we're used to. So that mix of familiarity and the unfamiliar and the, almost alien in some ways, that's what I take away from that.
I think when you consider that these excavations have been going on for so long and they have only uncovered such a tiny percentage of the whole site, and the thing is that when you've got 20 meters of depth of the Tell site, and they've gone over the rest of it with ground penetrating radar, but ground penetrating radar only goes down about 3 meters. So there could be an awful lot of stuff that's deeper into the earlier stages of the settlement. And I have to say, the excavations are going on. They are going to carry on for we don't know how long, a very long time. And I would just love it if they found something somewhere in the middle of the city that was like the communal place. This is where everybody came to party or whatever. Just, if they did find a communal place. Because the thing that gets me about it now is that from everything that's been uncovered, it's just people living. There's no signs of downtime. I think that's it. That's what I would really like to see.
Maybe evidence for an hierarchy. I'm not entirely convinced by the egalitarian, completely egalitarian society. I still think you need something, even if it is an egalitarian society, you can call it that, you still need something to hold it together. Leaders always emerge in societies, and there's very little mechanism by which you can prevent that if you've got a large number of people. People either come for themselves or people push them forwards. They feel, we need a leader under these circumstances. So open-minded completely. But I'd like them to find a special building, and and it would be a bit of a shock if they found a T-pillar, wouldn't it?